Okay, welcome to part 2. We're looking at the action of insulin. We're still on the same specification link, and in terms of the textbook, it's still 16.3 if you're using the AQA textbook. Uplift here from what we know at GCSE. We remember from GCSE that insulin puts the glucose in to cells. Well, what impact would that have on blood glucose? It would lower the blood glucose. We also know from GCSE that it's the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas that release insulin, and the way to remember it is that they put insulin, acts and puts glucose into the bin. In other words, beta cells release the insulin, insulin puts glucose into the cells. What else do we know? Well, insulin is a hormone. It's released from an endocrine gland directly into the blood. It travels all over the body and it causes effect at any cell that has the glycoprotein receptor. Insulin is a large protein. It's a globular protein, and when it fits onto that glycoprotein receptor that's found on many cell surface membranes, that's when it causes its effects. So let's have a look at our insulin receptor on our plasma membrane of the cell surface. We've got our protein and we've got our carbohydrate component, which makes this our glycoprotein, amongst our phospholipid bilayer. And basically, when the hormone insulin comes along and interacts with this protein, it causes several changes. One of them is it affects the shape of other proteins in the membrane. So this is a glucose carrier protein. When this forms a complementary bond with the insulin, this changes shape and it opens up to allow more glucose to pass into the cell. And this, of course, when we're moving glucose into the cell by insulin, reduces the concentration of glucose in the blood. Now, something we've not considered before is how do these proteins get into this membrane? And when you're born, are you fixed with them? Do they stay there forever? How does this work? Well, in actual fact, it's really clever. We can change the number of these protein channels that are in a cell surface membrane. How do we do that? Well, inside the cell, we've got vesicles. Now, let's remember that vesicles are membrane-bound sacs, and in actual fact, they also are made of their bilayer. And inside these vesicles, if you imagine I continued that on all the way, are carrier proteins. And what can happen? When insulin binds with this protein here, it causes these vesicles to move and fuse with the membrane. So now the vesicle has moved, the phospholipid bilayer has incorporated itself into the plasma membrane, and it's put that protein channel into the membrane. So instead of just having one here now, I've got two. So that means I can absorb more glucose. What impact does that have? If we put glucose into the cell, it means that the glucose levels in blood is lowered. It wants to convert the glucose into glycogen. And that is the process where we have glyco, because it's glycogen that we're making, and genesis. Genesis means making, so it's glycogenesis. So let's have a look at the third effect that insulin has in the cell. We've talked about insulin combines with the glycoprotein, and it changes the shape of other carrier proteins in the membrane, opening them up to allow glucose to move in. We've talked about insulin having an impact here, complementary, and what that does is it causes vesicles from inside the cell to move and fuse and increase the number of glucose carrier proteins. The third effect that it does is it wants to convert the new glucose inside the cell. It wants to get it outside the cell. By removing the glucose and changing it into glycogen inside the cell, we lower the concentration of glucose inside the cell. So if there was any facilitated diffusion that can happen, that the glucose will continue to move through the carrier protein. We talked about the mechanisms by which insulin interacts with the cell. What is the impact of that across the body? Well, the first thing we've got to think about is that by increasing the amount of glucose inside the cell, we also increase the rate of metabolism. It's a little bit like you've got a fire, and if you put more wood on the fire, it's going to burn at a faster rate. The other thing that we do is we increase the amount of glycogen, but beyond the glycogen, we'll also turn glucose into fat. We'll store the fat then in our fat cells. All this is possible because we've increased the rate of absorption of glucose by opening the channels and increasing the number of channels, and because we've increased the rate of the conversion of glucose within the cell.